In the winter of 1828, the city of Edinburgh was the medical capital of the world, but beneath the prestigious lecture halls and the Enlightenment philosophy lay a desperate, rotting hunger. To learn how to save the living, surgeons needed the dead, and they were running out. In this city of old town shadows, a new and terrifying industry was born. It began with resurrection men digging up the freshly buried, but it ended with something far worse, a pair of entrepreneurs named Burke and Hair who realized that waiting for people to die was bad for business. This is the dark history of the anatomy trade, where the price of medical progress was paid in human life. To understand the horror, we have to understand the law. In the early 19th century, the Murder Act of 1751 stipulated that the only bodies legally available for dissection were those of executed criminals. This wasn't a scientific regulation, it was a judicial one. Dissection was intended as a final post-mortem punishment, the denial of a decent burial. In a deeply religious society, this wasn't just a physical violation, it was perceived as a spiritual catastrophe. Many believed that without an intact body, the soul could not rise on Judgment Day. To be anatomized was to be erased from eternity. But as the Enlightenment took hold, the bloody code of British law, which once prescribed the death penalty for over 200 crimes, including shoplifting or damaging fish ponds, was gradually reformed. The gallows became quieter. As executions became rarer, the supply of legal cadavers dried up just as the demand for medical education exploded. Edinburgh, with its world-class medical school, became the center of this supply and demand crisis. Dr. Robert Knox, the most brilliant and arrogant anatomist of the age, had a classroom of 400 students who paid in gold to see the secrets of human muscle and bone. Knox was a pioneer of comprehensive anatomy, requiring a constant rotation of fresh subjects for his demonstrations. He famously operated under a "no questions asked" policy. He didn't care if a body arrived in a tea chest or a herring barrel, he only cared that it was fresh. This created a massive black market. A single corpse could fetch between 8 and 10 pounds, roughly the equivalent of 6 months' wages for a common laborer. In the squalid closes of the old town, a dead neighbor was suddenly worth more than a living one. This financial incentive gave rise to the resurrection men. These weren't just common thieves, they were tactical specialists who treated the graveyard like a military objective. They rarely dug a full grave, as that took too long and was too visible. Instead, they would dig a small extraction hole at the head of the coffin, break the wood with specialized iron crowbars, and use a hook or a rope to drag the body out by the neck. They were masters of efficiency, often clearing a grave and restoring the turf so perfectly that a grieving family would never know the soil had been disturbed. Crucially, they would leave the expensive clothes, jewelry, or shrouds behind. Under the law of the time, stealing the body was merely a misdemeanor, as a corpse was not considered property, while stealing clothing was a felony punishable by death. They were criminals, but they knew the legal loopholes. The people of Edinburgh lived in a state of grave panic. This led to an architectural arms race between the living and the dead. For those who could afford it, mort safes were commissioned, monstrous iron-grilled cages or heavy stone slabs bolted deep into the earth to prevent the resurrection men from prying the lids. In some cemeteries, like Greyfriars Kirkyard, families built high-walled iron enclosures known as caged lairs. Communities even constructed dead houses, reinforced stone bunkers where the deceased were locked and guarded for several weeks until the putrefaction had set in. Only when the body was too stale for the surgeons would it be safely committed to the earth. But even these defenses were vulnerable to the inside man. Resurrection men were masters of infiltration, often bribing the gravedigger's boy or the local watchman with gin and silver. On nights when the Edinburgh Har, the thick sea mist, was heavy enough to mask the sound of iron hitting stone, these guards would simply look the other way. The panic grew so intense that families began to bury their dead in their own back gardens or under floorboards, choosing the stench of decay over the risk of the surgeon's knife. The city had become a fortress of the dead, yet the walls were leaking and the hunger of the anatomy theaters was only growing. The transition from body snatching to active murder began not with a grand plan, but with a debt. In November 1827, an old army pensioner named Donald lived in William Hare's lodging house in Tanner's Close. He was a lonely figure, eking out a living on a small pension, but when he died of dropsy, he left behind a £4 debt in unpaid rent. For Hare, a man living on the razor's edge of poverty, this was an unacceptable loss. He didn't call the authorities. Instead, he called William Burke, a fellow Irish immigrant and cobbler. Together, they realized that Donald's body was a liquid asset. They filled the old man's coffin with bark from a nearby tannery to mimic the weight of a corpse and hauled the actual body in a tea chest to Surprise Square. They made their way to the rooms of Dr. Robert Knox. Without asking for a death certificate or an identity, Knox's assistants paid them £7 10 shillings, nearly double the debt Donald owed. It was the easiest money they had ever made. But nature was too slow for their newfound greed. The wait for the next natural death in the lodging house was agonizing. They quickly realized that they were surrounded by marketable commodities, lodgers who were sick, old, or without kin. Their second subject was a man suffering from a fever. Rather than nurse him or call a doctor, they simply waited for a moment of quiet and smothered him. By the third victim, Abigail Simpson, they had moved from opportunists to active predators. They realized the city was full of social ghosts, vulnerable people whose disappearance would cause no ripples in the polite society of the new town. The logistics of their factory were as chilling as the acts themselves. Tanner's Close was a labyrinth of urban decay, a place where screams were often ignored as the sounds of drunken brawls. To kill in such close quarters without alerting the other lodgers, they needed a method that was silent, bloodless, and left no forensic footprint for a local constable. They perfected a technique now known to history as Burking. The ritual was almost always the same. They would invite a victim into their rooms for hospitality, plying them with excessive amounts of cheap whiskey until they reached a state of near comatose stupor. Then the pair would strike. Hare would pin the victim's arms and sit heavily across their chest, using his body weight to collapse the rib cage and prevent the lungs from expanding. Simultaneously, Burke would press his hands over the victim's mouth and nose, pinching the nostrils shut with a cobbler's grip. This was suffocation from the outside in. It was an agonizing, terrifying way to die, but for the murderers, it was scientifically perfect. It left no bruising on the neck, no broken hyoid bone, and no external signs of struggle. It preserved the merchandise in a pristine, fresh state that delighted Dr. Knox. Once the life had flickered out, the body was folded into a tea chest or a herring barrel, sometimes while still warm. For nearly a year, this conveyor belt of death operated with terrifying success. They weren't just killing for survival, they were killing for a lifestyle. They bought new clothes, drank expensive spirits, and became well-known figures in the local taverns. They even involved their partners, Helen McDougall and Margaret Hare, who acted as lookouts or lures. They had discovered a dark loophole in the Enlightenment. As long as you provided the tools of progress for the elite would never ask how many lives were extinguished to produce them. The no questions asked policy of the anatomy theater wasn't just a convenience, it was a license to kill. The downfall of Burke and Hair is a masterclass in the arrogance of 19th century science. As their victims became more well known in the community, the medical silence began to crack. The most striking example was Mary Patterson, a young woman famed in the Canongate for her beauty and flowing hair. When she was delivered to Dr. Knox's rooms, still warm and showing no signs of disease or grave dirt, several of Knox's students recognized her. Some had seen her alive just hours earlier. Instead of calling for the high constables, Knox reportedly praised the aesthetic quality of the specimen and preserved her in whiskey for 3 months so his students could sketch her as if she were a classical statue. This clinical indifference reached a breaking point with daft Jamie Wilson. Jamie was a beloved local figure with a mental disability, known to everyone in Edinburgh. When he went missing, the neighborhood noticed. When his body appeared in the anatomy theater, the students whispered his name in horror. Sensing the unrest, Knox reportedly ordered the immediate dissection of Jamie's head and face, the most recognizable parts, to destroy the evidence before authority could intervene. The spree ended on Halloween night 1828 through a rare spark of conscience from a witness. Margaret Docherty, an elderly woman, was lured to the lodging house, but her presence sparked the suspicion of 2 other lodgers, the Greys. They discovered her body hidden under a pile of straw and ran for the police. By the time the authorities arrived at Knox's surgery, the body was already on the table, ready for the knife. The trial was a sensation, but the legal system failed to provide full closure. Because Burking left so few internal marks, the prosecution couldn't prove murder without a confession. In a move that outraged the public, William Hair was granted immunity to testify against William Burke. On January 28, 1829, 25,000 people gathered in the pouring rain to watch Burke hang. The public's fury then turned toward Dr. Robert Knox. Though never legally charged, he was hung in effigy outside his home by a mob chanting, "Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the boy that buys the beef." His career was ruined, a victim of the same clinical detachment that had fueled the murders. But the final irony was the most macabre. Under the same murder act that had fueled the trade, Burke's body was sent to the Edinburgh Medical College to be publicly dissected. The man who murdered for the anatomy table ended up on one. Over 30,000 people queued to see his internal organs. His skeleton was preserved and still hangs in the university's museum today. A book was even bound in his tanned skin, a permanent grisly reminder of the commodity he had become. The aftermath was a city in ruins. Dr. Robert Knox, though never legally charged, saw his reputation incinerated. Effigies of him were burned in the streets, his windows were smashed, and he was eventually forced to flee to London, where he died in relative obscurity. The public didn't blame him for the science, they blamed him for the complicity. In 1832, the British Parliament finally passed the Anatomy Act. This legislation effectively killed the black market by making bodies legally available from workhouses and hospitals. But it replaced the resurrection man with a new kind of dread, the pauper's grave. It codified the idea that if you were poor and died without family, your body belonged to the state. The story of Burke and Hair is a reminder that medical progress often has a dark shadow. We live longer, healthier lives today because of the secrets mapped out on those dissecting tables, but the cost was the dignity and the lives of those who were invisible to society. As you look at the medical diagrams in a modern textbook, remember that the lines were drawn in the shadows of Tanner's Close. Next time, we look at how science finally stopped the Victorian poisoners. I'm Apothecary Archives, and this has been the Poisoner's Ledger.